Hello everyone, and thank you very much for making it. I am Giulio Prisco, and I'm going to host today's Terasem Colloquium, whose theme is early days of a better spaceflight revolution. Let me share my screen first. Can someone confirm that you're seeing something on your screen?
We see it, although it's orientation.
No, that is intended as an artistic effect. Okay. So this Terasem Colloquium, as usual, take place on July 20, the anniversary of the first human landing on the moon, which was really a spaceflight revolution in the 60s, as Bill Bambridge is going to say. We may be now in the early days of a better spaceflight revolution, and this colloquium is going to be dedicated to this. Now, as I see things, the beautiful Apollo adventure that we have been living through between 1968 and 72, this is the famous Earthrise picture, was only a proof of concept for things that were to come. Unfortunately, 60 years later, but I'll say better late than never. And this is the new Earthrise, or actually Earthsat, taken by Artemis 2 a few months ago. And 2026 might, I think it will, but let's be prudent and say might, mark the beginning of real lunar operations. And we are about to see, I hope, permanent and sustainable operations on the moon. Now, let me just show this. You won't understand it, but what do I mean by don't forget the elephant in the room? I've been speaking about that a lot. And what I mean by the elephant in the room where all space enthusiasts congregate is that, there is this thing that we all know, but most people don't even want to talk about that, which is that artificial intelligence, the first and subsequent generation of our mind children who are coming to life now, is likely to play a more important role in our expansion into space. I think in this century we will have beautiful adventure with our AI mind children in the solar system, but when the time will come to move to the stars, I think it's quite inevitable that artificial intelligence will play the dominant role, and that I think is something that we all have to make peace with. We dedicated a Terasem Colloquium last year to discussing this, and I think we will have more and more opportunities to discuss this. Let's come to the introduction of the speakers. We're going to start with Bill Bambridge, who wrote this beautiful, I have been reading it again, the Spaceflight Revolution book in the 70s. Is a sociological study which is very worth reading and rereading now. Bill is going to update us on this. Next speaker is a space philosopher, Rebecca Lauer. She hasn't joined yet. After her, or perhaps later because she may be late, we will have Namrata Goswami, the author of several interesting publications, including the book Scramble for the Skies, co-authored with Peter Garretson, which is a really fascinating roundup of ideas and scenario for the next few decades in space. Angela Meyers, which is the author of this interesting book that I started reading called Versatile Human Intelligence in an Artificial Age, will follow. Perhaps we will switch her with Namrata. Rick Tomlinson is scheduled to participate and say something about his last book published a few months ago called Why Space? The Purpose of People. I've been reading it. It's really an excellent book. And then Robert will follow with an introduction to his new book called Future Proofing Humanity. And I have also read this one, highly, highly recommended. As I would like to recommend warmly the book Still as Bright by Christopher Kokinos, who was supposed to be the last speaker today, but it appears that he cannot make it because he's not feeling well. No, he's not feeling well. Nothing catastrophic, I understand. But, you know, we will miss him today. But I look forward to inviting him at one of the next colloquia. Just let me say that together with this colloquium, we have published a new issue of Terasem's Journal of Personal Cyber Consciousness, which has a number of articles by several people, including some of today's speakers, namely Bill, Angela, and myself. Having said this, I stopped screen sharing and I will give the floor to Bill, just chat with the audience while I put your slide presentation on. One warning, well, first I would like to ask everyone to keep their microphone off when other people are speaking or when they do not want to speak themselves. Of course, remember to switch your microphone on again if you want to speak. I will keep my own microphone and video switched off most of the time because I may have to make some unpleasant noise to discipline my dogs, who are not really behaving as they should today. However, I'm going to give the floor to Bill. Just say something, so I'll spend a couple of minutes to put your slide presentation on. The floor is yours, Bill.
I am ready if you put the PowerPoint up.
I will. Okay, so can someone confirm that you're seeing the first slide from Bill? Yes?
No, I'm not seeing it.
Oh, yeah, right. You're not seeing it because I was not sharing the screen. But now you should see it.
Yes, I can see it. Shall
That's
I
great.
start?
Sure.
Well, thank you for having shown a picture of the book that came from my 1975 Harvard doctoral dissertation. This is a photograph I took as part of the field research I did on the Spaceflight Revolution, the last launch to the surface of the moon. And thank you also for mentioning the recent issue of Journal of Cyber Consciousness, which has two of my articles, which are highlighted here. Yes, I take spaceflight personally and suggest we should all do that, even imagining how advanced information technologies like artificial intelligence and robotics might allow us to travel all across our galaxy, perhaps in virtual reality. But other of these possibilities stalled at the end of 1972. When Apollo ended, so did the separate nuclear engine for rocket vehicle application, NERVA development. Subsequently, the Space Shuttle Low Earth Orbital Spacecraft System operated from 1981 to 2011 with the fatal loss of Challenger 1986 and Columbia 2003. Next slide, please, Julia. Well, we seem to be returning to the moon, although not yet to its surface. And one of the very important things about Artemis, which is named after a goddess, the twin sibling of Apollo, named after a god, is the diversity of people from around the world who are involved, who are collaborating, and who hopefully may thereby unify. Next slide, please. This is a simple version of a table from the article Outer Space is the Endless Frontier, where I simply put the standard descriptions of the 4 crew members. And here the backup crew had one of them needed a replacement, plus an analysis, bigger on the article, of how their individual Wikipedia pages were viewed. The one for the pilot does show the limitations of Wikipedia data, because for a while they had the mailing, they had the online address of his most popular online Wikipedia page wrong. But we do see that the Wikipedia page views increased greatly from March to April 1. Ironically, the April Fool's Day launch on April 1. We also see that quite officially, the crew members were described in terms of gender and perhaps ethnicity as showing a great variety. Next slide, please. And Europe was involved and may be contributing astronauts to later missions, providing the European Service Module. This is just a picture from the European Space Agency's website. That this really is an international exploration adventure, not just one nation competing against all of the others. Next slide, please. Ah, yes, the past. That book on the left was my doctoral dissertation. The book on the right was one of the subsequent studies I did. Goals in Space used a 2-stage survey method with Harvard students as the respondents. I had returned for a few years to Harvard as a faculty member after my tenure at University of Washington. In stage 1 of my survey, Harvard students wrote responses to open-ended questions about the goals for the space program, which were carefully combined and edited to form 125 fixed choice items, which were rated by respondents to the second survey. In 1997, I went online with that methodology, launching the Question Factory. I participated in the vast online Survey 2000, sponsored by the National Geographic Society. The very last item in Survey 2000 had been developed in the question factory and said, imagine the future and try to predict how the world will change over the next century. Think about everyday life as well as major changes in society, culture, and technology. About half of the roughly 46,500 adults who responded to Survey 2000 gave thoughtful answers to this question, producing more than 10 megabytes of text. Careful work derived 2,000 predictions about the future that became the items in a software system I programmed titled Year 2100. Next slide, please. And here is a pair of pictures of its introduction on the left, and answering a question on the right. The meek will inherit the earth, and the brave will travel to other worlds. Is that likely to be true in the future or unlikely? Would that be good or bad? And you see that this particular respondent rated it as 7 on the 1 to 8 good scale, but only 3 on the 1 to 8 unlikely to likely scale. Now, I must admit that the data in my 10 software modules that allow you to capture your own thoughts, I needed to have test data to display how the thing worked. And so I answered all the questions myself. Next slide, please. And a couple of years ago, lifenot.com worked with me to make available through a more modern and online system subsets of items from some of those earlier studies, selecting items that were clear, selecting items that were still relevant, 500 from each of the 2000 year 2100 items in 5 sections of 100 items each. And the picture at the right, the bottom of it, is simply a quick overview of the distribution of responses to one of the subsets of 2100. And the colored bands above it simply, well, I was entered as the person entering the data, and I could go to the part 1 of 5 of the self questions, which I was already working on, or to the first 100 items of experiences. And the use of many large questionnaires about the human future, one's perception of oneself, and experiences one rated that one had actually had during this life, offered to preserve individuals' mind files. We also had a version of the standard Big 5 personality dimensions, and generally believe that there are many opportunities for questionnaire, interview, and other kinds of data collection to preserve the minds of individuals. Next slide, please. That's the same one. Okay, going back in time. Golly, was I really nearly bald? back in 1989. Yeah, that's true. I hope that some of what was inside my skull was preserved, given that much of what was outside it has since been lost. But that was after the Challenger disaster. And my comment was, unfortunately, rather pessimistic, but it shows me standing in front of a bunch of old style personal computers of the types I was working on. And the shuttle program, of course, 2 of them exploded, killing all 7 astronauts in both cases. And we don't really know yet whether the current rockets are much safer. But there also is the problem that the shuttle was not as efficient, not nearly as efficient as we hoped. Parts of the boosters were preserved, fixed up, and reused, but that was costly. And so we may still face the issue of how to get into orbit safely and cheaply. Julio, next one, please. Don't those two look totally different? Maybe not. They're both using liquid fuel rocket engines, different in the details, but not hugely different in the principles. And Apollo 11 and Artemis 2 both carried people to the distance of the moon, and Artemis 2 may take them back to the surface in a couple or 3 or 4 years. And maybe we move on from there. Next slide, please. There is a hope that these unwinged launch vehicles could be reused. I guess we'll see. It's not clear to me why it's vastly safer. It may be more efficient if the entire rocket is preserved, except that the ones we saw in the earlier slide, the Artemis 2 had side launch vehicles as well. Also, the inclusion of major corporations, SpaceX and Blue Origin, and SpaceX involves artificial intelligence as well as rockets. So we may be headed for a continuing spaceflight revolution rather than one followed by an empty half century. Next slide, please. And indeed, there are plans for NASA to produce a nuclear-powered, but not direct nuclear rocket, rather an ordinary nuclear power system producing electricity, which solar panels also could do, to drive powdered reaction mass at a high rate out of a magnetic electrical kind of engine. Thus, both solar-powered and nuclear-powered electric propulsion in deep space is possible, and both would work to Mars, given there's enough sunshine. We shall see. Next, please, Julio. I changed the background color because we've gone from history to imagination. Norway launched a remarkably innovative, massively multiplayer online game in the year 2001 described appropriately here, and I've spent hundreds of hours in it. It is not officially, but I tended to think inspired by the Dune novels that Frank Herbert wrote. He died in 1986 because the desert planet Rubica has a mineral known as notum that is highly valuable and only obtainable there. Well, in the Dune stories, that gave human minds more power, and indeed was used for human minds in the novels to replace and outlaw artificial intelligence. So while that is not explicitly in Anarchy Online, there is the theme of how can we form new societies, perhaps by experimenting with multiple different kinds. Next slide, please. And indeed, we might set up a city on the real planet Mars from which human beings could operate telerobots that represented them directly and in real time. We can't do that from here because Mars is too far away and it takes the signals too long to come back and forth. If a local robot has its own artificial intelligence, yes, we can send it messages, as has been done, to guide its behavior, but not moment to moment, not in real time. But if humans lived in cities on Mars, they could control Mars robots directly. Next slide, please. And amazingly, Anarchy Online is still there, a quarter of a century later, obviously primitive and not very popular, and so on. The company that produced it, Funcom, currently owned by a Chinese company. And indeed, the industry of virtual worlds has been pretty chaotic for a bit over a decade. But I just wanted you to know about this marvelous historical example directly related to the future of space exploration. Next slide, please. Now, there were others, of course, and in 2016, I published this book about 4 different virtual worlds, 2 each based on Star Wars and Star Trek franchises, that explored freedom versus control in online game worlds as a way of making us think about freedom versus control in the world we directly experience in our everyday lives. Next slide, please. And here's a picture of Simula-Tion, not simulation, Simula-Tion, with her set of robots that she could run inside Star Wars Galaxies, which ran 2003 to 2011, and unfortunately was shut down when the copyright was taken away and used for something else. Next slide, please. A series of novels by Edgar Rice Burroughs that began in 1912 imagined our minds could migrate to Mars, even if our bodies remained on Earth. central to his stories and so many that followed about online worlds, imagined creative, competing cultures, not just one out there. So that's an interesting aspect of the possibility of colonizing real outer space, that the colonies may differ, as my New England heritage differs from my wife's Bolivian heritage in terms of the cultures of the past. Perhaps information technologies today will indeed allow us to continue exploration of Mars in detail using robot rovers. But now, adding the memories and experiences of real people to their artificial intelligence. Yes, colonization of Mars that places real people in cities, perhaps beneath the surface of the planet, from which they could directly operate machine representatives across the harsh surface of the planet. And what other locations in our complex solar system could then build upon the Martian success? Ultimately, and much of my recent research, of course, is focused on this, independent creation of a social movement here on Earth to develop the needed systems and preserve the minds of living people for later virtual revival throughout the cosmos. Yes, LifeNaut and Terasem movement are prototypes or the initial beginning of a widespread movement that may be inspired by the future Artemis successes and then electric nuclear delivery of humans to Mars. That is really possible. Next slide, please. Funcom last year did launch a new Dune Awakening, explicitly based on the novels. Next slide, please. It does have a Facebook community, not very popular, frankly. Yes, a couple of tens of thousands of members, but not millions yet. And we cannot be sure. Next slide, please. Other experiments over the past dozen years have prepared us technically in the virtual world environment, but not been very successful. NASA was actually involved in development of this simulation that indeed simulated humans in large vehicles, sending smaller robots automatically controlled out to explore and perform various actions, such as preparing to build the infrastructure of a colony. Next slide, please. And I did explore the half-started, never quite finished building of serious towns on a simulated Mars. Have you got what it takes to survive on Mars? Well, Roke allowed you to make the red planet your sandbox and create a thriving colony. Unfortunately, I'm almost done. Unfortunately, it was unpopular. Next and last slide, please. This is indeed the last slide. And perhaps the worldwide involvement in space exploration will make it vastly more popular and a focus of human unification. Thank you. I'm done. Any comments or questions before we move on?
Yes, let me just recover control of the interface. It usually happens when, where is it? Okay. It usually happens when we share a screen. I didn't have time to read the chat, which I'm doing now to see discussions and maybe questions. So I'll start with a question that came to my mind. You quoted this beautiful fictional sentence that the meek will inherit the earth while the brave will go to the stars. Now, this sentence that I love is usually attributed to Lazarus Long, the character of Robert Heinlein, but I have never been able to find it in any of Heinlein's book. Perhaps you can point me to the original publication of this quote.
Well, that particular set of 2,000 items came from the Survey 2000. And so some respondent, or more than one respondent to that survey, may have quoted it approximately. We're not asked to give citations. And so the text, as I got it, came from respondent to an open-ended item on an earlier study. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It still doesn't point to the source of that quote, but since I love Robert Heinlein, I will continue reading his
Maybe
books.
they invented it. Maybe it was
No, because it's frequently heard. I have heard that quote many times, and it's always.
Well, I will go ask one of my AI friends to help you look for it.
It is always attributed to Lazarus Long. Now, I'm well, first, do we have other questions for Bill?
It's possible we'll have a discussion at the end as well, where we put things together.
Right, especially because we are missing the last speaker. So I'm sure we'll get the chance to continue the discussion. In the meantime, let me check if the next speaker, who is Rebecca Lau, is here. And yes, she is. Since we had never been in a Zoom call together, I'd like to introduce myself. Great to meet you, Rebecca. I'm Julia. So I look forward to hearing from you, and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much. Thank you for the invitation. And yeah, that was a really awesome first talk there from Bill. So I'm really happy to come next. So I think I was asked vaguely to give some thoughts about the cultural and philosophical aspects of lunar operations in the next decade, what could come after that. I know that's what we're talking about generally. I'm a philosopher, so I guess I'll mostly focus on the philosophical aspects, although I'm very interested in culture. And I think on some level, being a philosopher is a cultural matter. I might come to that in a moment in terms of what I see as the sort of division of labor in talking about these things. So I'm based at the Mercatus Center, which is a research center at George Mason University here in Arlington, Virginia. I mostly write about freedom and rights, and I've often applied this in my work to questions about space. I'm particularly interested in property rights in space. I'm very interested in the idea of life in space, both in terms of humans going to space and in terms of the kinds of life we might find in space. But recently, I've been hiring a couple of space people to work with me. We have 2 new space policy research fellows at Mercatus. I'm very excited about this. And we've just launched a little Substack called Space Jam. Just about a week ago, we've already got 500 subscribers. So if you're interested in space policy, check out Space Jam. This title obviously is a reference to the very cool 90s movie. I'm betraying my age by pointing this out, but also it is a signal of our interest in some of the cultural aspects. So we think about things like innovation and competition, federalism, property rights, but also the cultural aspect. So in terms of this question about lunar operations in the next decade and what might come after that, well, I mean, as a philosopher, I'm not very good at predicting things. That's not really what we do. We tend to analyze current things. We tend to think about how things should be rather than how things will be. We tend to leave that more to the economists, although we do talk with them. So I want to think a little about some of those, what we moral philosophers would think of as normative questions, how things should be. We use it slightly differently from the economists. So one of the things I've written about quite a bit, and I think about quite a bit, is this question about property rights in space. This is incredibly important for this question that we're thinking about in terms of lunar operations. As you know, there is a big outer space treaty that blocks ownership, national appropriation is forbidden, and by implication, ownership by anyone of anything, particularly the celestial body. That's the kind of standard space law conclusion. Yet at the same time, owning things in space has become increasingly valuable, not just financially valuable. I think there's also great value in terms of the conservation aspect. We know from Earth that justified and effective systems of property rights can help to conserve goods, can help us to better allocate, can help to incentivize being productive. So this is a problem. It's also a problem because if you don't set this stuff in place in advance in a good way, people will just land grab. This has moral implications. It also can be very economically inefficient. If you just get to Mars first, therefore you get Mars forever for you and your kids, there might well be some quite serious opportunity cost. Like I say, I don't think this is just about people betting on asteroid mining. I think it's also about scientific inquiry, the kinds of knowledge we can derive from doing more in space, whether that's through research on the bodies of celestial objects or whether that's through going further out into space. There are questions also about rights over orbital matters that we've seen in low Earth orbit with satellites. This stuff is only going to become more and more pressing as our technology continues to develop so quickly. There are also, of course, all these big military implications. My friends who do defense policy have been talking about this for quite a long time. The rest of the policy community seems to be quite slow in catching up and understanding the serious military implications of the new technological advancements we're seeing around about us. So we pretty quickly, I think, need to think about how to go about addressing this. It's pretty hard to get international cooperation on things when the key spacefaring nations are either at war or at proxy in wars. I think there's also a great cultural benefit of coming together and collaborating over these matters. There are questions also not just about things like property rights allocation when we get there, but also how we get there. So one of the things me and the policy guys are thinking about at Mercatus are questions around regulation and innovation. So as we see concurrently with AI, sometimes regulation, which was designed at a time before the technology was invented, isn't very fit for purpose. Whether you're somebody more on the side of we should be more safe, or whether you're somebody more on the side of we need to just let it rip and work out what we can do, we need well-designed regulation. And in fact, if you look at some of, for instance, the small companies in the space economy, I was lucky to get to know some small British companies back when I used to live in London. And there are some amazing things going on, but sometimes they're held back by outdated regulation. And this is not something I think that the policy people are thinking about sufficiently enough. So that's point one, something about we should think more about the property stuff. I hope we do think more about it. My guess is, sadly, we'll continue to drag and things will get worse. Similarly, on the militarization front, this isn't a big focus for me. In fact, I think one of the benefits of doing this policy stuff at Mercatus, where we're mostly a community of economists, some philosophers like me, we're not somewhere where we focus on defense much. We're also not somewhere that has commercial interests. We have charitable status. We're a nonprofit. So I think we're well placed to have neutrality. But nonetheless, clearly the militarization point is incredibly important. People are starting to see this stuff because they see, for instance, the role that Starlink plays in the Russia-Ukraine war. They maybe look at budgets and they see increasing percentages of national budgets spent on space defense matters within military budgets. But defense implies offense, as I like to say. There's now a Space Force. A lot of people don't even know about this. Some people also, I see this often, people saying things like, hey, look, the Cold War was good for bringing about unity in America or something like this. And we have this opportunity, this race against China kind of thing. I mean, I have to say, maybe I'm just a boring moral philosopher, but I tend to think war is like kind of bad all around. So I do think there are great advantages to be derived from collaboration, but I'm not sure the way to get there is by setting militaristic goals. So I think this is also something that philosophers and policy people should take more seriously, analyze, work out what the good options are. The third point I want to make, which I already touched on a little, is about science and knowledge. One of my space policy people at Mercatus, Arkrith Harakumar, he was at SAIS. He's a very, very smart guy, thinks about geopolitics, just wrote an excellent piece for us about space funding, asking these questions around, imagine the government has allocated some funding towards science research. Okay, but then how should that funding be allocated? And problems when the state wants to get involved at that level of determining the merits or the value in other senses of scientific research. Important questions. My friend Casey Dreyer, who I know Chris, who sadly can't be with us today, through Casey at the Planetary Society, has also written some awesome stuff about the science funding question. He wrote a very good paper, which I really like, about the implications of reducing, and I'm not somebody who thinks that just because something is needed, therefore the state has to fund it, or that all kinds of science funding are always required or anything like that. But he makes great points, not just about the lost knowledge when funding is removed, when it's been planned upon, but also things around the competing goals sometimes of landing on a planet and populating a planet and doing scientific research on the planet. He makes this very nice point about once you get there and you disrupt the land, you may have lost the opportunity forever to research the land. So if you don't have the people thinking about these matters involved in the planning, this is an implication I derive from what he wrote, then you can really lose opportunities forever in terms of learning new knowledge about places out there in our solar system and beyond. Obviously, there are also these important questions about knowing new things about medicine and about monitoring. Coming back to the militarization point, one of the benefits of the rise in satellite technology, of course, is learning new things that bad actors are doing on Earth. We know about the Uyghur concentration camps in China. Because of satellite technology, we can learn about things like climate change, but monitoring can also have a negative side in terms of surveillance. So we have these opportunities to drive new knowledge, whether it's about our planet or whether it's about stuff up there, these exciting missions about the places in our solar system that are most conducive to life, all these astonishing missions. I'm amazed that the public isn't more excited about this, but maybe the public isn't as excited about the possibility of aliens as I am. But there's 7 or 8 current and upcoming NASA missions looking at places where there's either has been water or we think there is water. I feel like this is very exciting. So I just want to finish by touching on this point around, as a moral philosopher, I'm very interested in trying to get ahead of the game and thinking about what the kinds of obligations we would have to life elsewhere outside of Earth. I think we're not always very good at thinking about our obligations to living things on Earth. So I feel like having this new set of living things might afford us the opportunity to refine some of our thinking about the qualities that different kinds of living things have, questions about consciousness, questions about sentience, questions about intelligence. I think AI offers us this opportunity. I'll put my cards on the table and say I don't think AI is conscious or alive, But the fact that I had a very interesting argument about it with a computer science guy last week at a conference about this. It's like, no, Rebecca, everyone thinks it's alive. I think it's alive. And as a philosopher, it's quite fun to have to argue why I think that's not the case. I think aliens will offer us some comparable questions, but they, if they're up there, will be more obviously alive than AI is. I think this is very interesting. And we should get ahead of the game. Not least because my fear is that if we discover living things, even if it's just teeny tiny little bits of bacteria, there will be some kind of panic and people will want to hate the living things. They will want to fight the living things. They will think that the living things pose a threat to us. And maybe in more of a sense than just we could gain diseases. I don't know about that. I'm not a space biologist, but they will think that they're coming for us. This seems to me the kind of fear that could get ahead of you and end up making that the case when it might not be the case. One of the things I'm most excited about is the opportunity that learning about other living things in the universe might offer for friendship, for us to help them. For instance, maybe we can solve alien cancer. I don't hear anybody talking about this. And I'm not a messaging person, but my guess is those of us who care about those things should start saying this stuff and saying it quite loud. The opportunity for friendship with other living things in the universe seems to me like the most incredible opportunity. Imagine that we're the people who are alive at the time we learn about this. We have this incredible opportunity to try to push for peace and friendship. And I think that's very exciting. I see somebody mentioning about the disclosures on Earth now. I'm also following this very closely, and I find this also very exciting. Some of my friends think I'm crazy. I'm a little WhatsApp group with some of my friends about this, and I think all the other people think we're mad. Again, I'll put my cards on the table and think, I don't think we're going to learn from these disclosures that there are little green men at Roswell, but I think there's something going on, and I think there's more stuff to learn. I also have a side interest in things like the obligations of state transparency, and minimally what we're learning is that stuff has been withheld persistently, important stuff, and this should tell us something about our need to interrogate more closely the information the state gives us. So I think that's very important. I'll finish by saying, which I touched on a little earlier, that I really think there's an important division of labor here, as my friends, the economists, like to say. I think this is not just a matter for the economists and the lawyers. I think it's a matter for the philosophers. It's not just a matter for the scientists. We all need to talk with each other. I'm a big fan of the kind of interdisciplinarity in which you bring your expertise and then you help each other by giving good feedback, by asking new questions, by showing new kinds of arguments. Not so that we all become a little bit of an expert in each of the things, but such that we have deep and broad expertise among us as a group. So I think the philosophers need to step up more. I'm astonished persistently that the other philosophers I know are not as obsessed by this stuff as me. I think it's a moment, this moment of AI and this moment of potential aliens, where the philosophers have a really big role to play. We can bring some of the thinking and some of the analytic capacity that we have to bear on these very, very important questions for humankind. I'm also generally an optimist. I think there are amazing things that we can achieve, and I think amazing things are being achieved around us faster than probably we can even guess. But I think we've got to get ahead of the game. I think we've got to think about things like what are justified frameworks for dealing with these things before we learn the stuff, such that we don't just get people rushing in and wrecking stuff, whether that's wrecking stuff for scientific missions by spoiling the surface of planets before we've had time to think about what we could learn, whether that's wrecking things in terms of allowing land grabs by not putting in place effective and justified property rights systems, and whether that's wrecking things by allowing popular sentiment to put us against the aliens before we even know who they are. So I'll finish with that. But yeah, a bit of a shout out for my colleagues at Kate is working on the space stuff, Arkrith Harakuma and Max Harden. They're writing great things if you're interested in this stuff, whether it's state level space policy, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's regulation at all of the different levels. And also a shout out for the philosophers, because we need to do more of this stuff. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. You touched on some of the most interesting things that are happening today, including this disclosure thing, little green man. I see Angela in the chat saying that she's open to the possibility. I'm kind of skeptical, but very interested. And you also touched on what perhaps, at least I think, is the most important philosophical question of our time. which is whether we can meaningfully say that the current generation of AI is, between brackets, alive, or if not, if the next generation could be. I want to give you guys time to think of intelligent things to say about all that, but I want to come to another point. You touched many times on the militarization of space issue, and I think here we all agree that war is not a good thing, it's a very bad thing, and that we should think less about military stuff and more about other things. However, as a student of history, looking back a few centuries or perhaps a few thousands of years, I see that in history, military implications, especially the possibility of future military applications, have always been the drivers of important waves of progress, and not only in terms of colonization and this stuff, but also and even in the scientific endeavor, finding new science, funding the finding of new science. There is always an undertone, oh yes, let's do that because perhaps we could use these things on the battlefield tomorrow. So that even assuming that we all agree that war is a bad thing, what do you think about that? Do you think military implications will continue to be among the major drivers of space expansion? And should we just make peace with this idea?
Well, I mean, I'd say I kind of assume that that will continue to be the case for at least some time. I mean, particularly if you look at America and the role that, I mean, I don't know, look at DARPA and the role that defense implies offense, has played in the development of many important technologies. But again, as a philosopher who's interested in how things should be rather than just how things are or how things have been or how things might be, I'd say first, I'm a big exponent of the idea that the ends don't justify the means. Just because things bring about good things, that doesn't mean that those things themselves are okay. And also the idea that just because something's been done in one particular way in the past, that doesn't mean that it can only be done that way in the future. Um, there are other ways to develop these things, and if not developing them alongside military goals means doing it a little more slowly or maybe getting slightly different results, I'm personally happy to take that hit. I think there are a few things I'm more opposed to than the idea of justifying war on the grounds that it brings about good things. And I know that's not exactly what you're saying, but yeah, so I think don't become some kind of determinist because things have been done that way in the past, and don't fall into the trap of justifying bad things because in the past they've brought about good things. Of course, bad things can bring about good side effects. We know this. But that, for me at least, is not a sufficient justification for the bad things to be planned and done.
Thank you. That was a very thoughtful answer, and you have given me food for thoughts. Before moving on, do you have other questions for Rebecca? Just speak or maybe type in the chat.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I have kind of a spicy question to your comment about people freaking out about alien life. I've been kind of thinking more like the opposite. I think if we did meet some kind of like little green men, that people would be very positive towards them. And I think that the religious may even try to claim them as like their God's kind of creation or, created people too. And then I think many people try to maybe even like evangelize them. And then some people may say, oh, well, they're demons or something. And that's more of an alignment issue with, whoever created us maybe in this kind of simulation or something like that. So yeah, I think people might actually have like a rather positive effect towards, um, you know, meeting aliens.
It's a very nice point. I should think more about it. I would say religion has often led people, sadly, into fighting with each other. So even if people on Earth treat the little green men as gods, I'm not sure that that would necessarily be a kind of Irenic solution. The other thing I would say, I mean, I know I kind of jokingly set aside the idea of the little green men at Roswell. I'm not like fundamentally opposed to them being little and green and men. It's just I'm not sure that, Steven Spielberg has any particular insight into what the aliens look like. Um, so yeah, I don't want to be kind of a biased ahead of the game on that. Um, yeah, I think oftentimes people turn to religion to explain things that they don't know much about. I think philosophers can offer alternative approaches to thinking about things. One thing we like to do as philosophers, or at least analytic philosophers like me, is make comparisons. So find kind of nearby things that are useful to compare stuff with. And gods might be one of those things. But my guess is that maybe humans might be a better comparison than gods, partly because we don't really know much about gods, and gods are not physical, biological things. Um, so maybe drawing some of the similarities between these living things and us might be a useful kind of touch point. But I think you're right. I can only assume that, yes, some people would indeed want to worship these things. I don't fundamentally have anything against that per se. But having these conversations before we find them, my guess is probably quite useful to helping people regulate their response when it happens. Not least because, as I say, I do think that panic can sometimes come about, and that might be bad for us and for the aliens, regardless of whether we intend it for good reasons or not. It's a great question.
Yeah, right. Like we might have an extreme reaction, like either very good or very bad, and it'll be kind of split. And then over time, maybe it'll be more in the center or something like that.
One final thing I would say is that my guess is it's quite bad to treat something as a god when it's not a god. When you treat something as a god, you're less likely to treat it as an equal. So one view I have, I think we should get rid of the monarchy in the UK for many reasons, but one reason is I think it's bad to treat people as if they're superior to you, as if they're not part of political equality. And if we treat the aliens as gods, we might not take them very seriously. We might think that they're some special thing to be worshipped and not engaged with in ordinary ways. And that might mean that we miss out, for instance, on this point of gaining some friendship. So yeah, I think it's not good to treat something as a god when it's not a god, I think is another thing I'd say. Sorry, that's a very philosopher thing to say, but I'm a philosopher, so there you go.
So before letting Rebecca go, I will just expose her to some of the weirder aspects of Terasem and ask, what do you think about the possibility that future humans could become like gods in any sense of the word, in any sense of the word that we are even able to imagine at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, people often turn to these classic conditions that they think things need to meet to be gods. Maybe they have to be all knowing. Maybe they have to be all good. Maybe they have to be all powerful. These are some standard things. I don't see humans as humans currently are, as being all knowing in the classic sense of the god being all knowing or being all good. I think if humans were all good, something drastically wrong would have happened to us. So drastically bad even. And I don't see us being all powerful. One thing I am quite open to, though, is the idea that we could persist forever, either in physical form or in mental form. Not because I think we can be uploaded to the cloud, but because I think it's something we should take quite seriously, the idea that maybe our minds persist after our bodily death. Some people might attribute that kind of quality to gods, saying that gods live forever. But I think that's probably where I'd constrain myself.
Martina, you just said something very interesting in the chat, which goes to the heart of this point. Do you want to read it or should I? So I believe maybe Martine doesn't have the microphone working. However, she said that Terasem theosophy is that we are God in the making.
Yeah, this is very interesting question in Locke. I like reading John Locke. Well, it's a question that comes from that. Like, what kinds of things can God make? Can God be made? Can we make a God? The idea that a God is in the making. Yeah, I mean, if certainly if God is all powerful, the idea that God can be made or can be in the process of being made, therefore is not all powerful. I don't know. It's interesting. I'm not sure about that. Again, it just depends on what your conception of God is, right? I'm just gonna take the easy way.
Yeah, one thing that I would add, Julio, is that Terasem basically has a twin theosophical point here. One, that by the definition of God being omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent, it's beyond obvious that there is no God now, not here or anywhere in the universe. On the other hand, it's also undeniable that incrementally intelligence is accreting some beginning building blocks toward omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence. Haltingly, sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, like right now with all kind of nuclear arm reduction treaties going by the wayside and so on. But nevertheless, that's what's meant by in the making. And I think that AI is very much part of our in the making of this godness. And that's the really the fundamental building block belief of Terasem. Going back off mic.
If I could just very quickly respond. I mean, so if the idea is that individual humans will become godlike, then I think we can't rely upon, say, something like humankind becomes more powerful through nuclear weapons, unless you're talking about some particular individual person who has that power. And in terms of omniscience, the traditional understanding, at least as far as I know it, is something like knowing all of the things that are going on in the universe at all times. I don't think I can see humans, individual humans, being able to do that. So there may be some category question around the capacities of humankind and the capacities of an individual human. But anyway, I mean, this is very interesting philosophical chat, but I feel like I've probably taken up too much time. So I will
No,
think more on these
Rebecca, I don't
matters.
think, Martine here, I don't think you've taken up too much time. I think your talk was excellent, superb, equal to the quality of Professor Bainbridge's. But I was not saying that, nor is Terasem saying that individual humans are becoming gods. In fact, our belief is that individuals only exist as part of a collective consciousness. We're kind of under a delusion of individuality, sort of like cells in a body, thinking that they are standalone cells and not part of the, collective body. So when I
Okay.
definitely was not saying that nuclear weapons make us closer to God. It was actually just the opposite. By right now, we're going backwards by repealing nuclear arms limitation agreements. We are becoming less godlike because we're becoming less beneficent.
Yes. I mean, we are going to part ways on the idea of the collective consciousness. I don't know what it means to do things like have knowledge, bear knowledge, reason on things, deliberate on things, in the sense in which I myself do that as a group. I can think about us doing it as members of a group together and sharing ideas and me saying one thing and you saying another thing. I don't know what it means as a group to bear knowledge. I don't know what it means as a group um, to kind of persist um, as an individuated thing. So yeah, I think that's something where we're going to part ways. It's an
May
interesting
I
idea.
add a
Well, I think there
concept?
is a good example of that in, we had just finished watching the World Football Cup, and I think there is a sense in which a football team can be considered as something that persists over time, even if all the players are changed. Unfortunately, in Argentina's play last night, I didn't recognize the Argentina of Diego Maradona, so that something has changed on the way. But Spain has been playing consistently well, just like it did in 2010, even if all the players were not the same.
Yes, I mean that's a nice point. But even if I accept that therefore the group is something that persists across time in this individuated way, I'm not sure why I would think that the group does things like bears knowledge, which I think is a problem for the idea of the group having consciousness. I think it's the individual members of the group that bear knowledge, and then they share that knowledge with each other such that one of them knows that the ball is here and one of them knows that the ref is there. So yes, I mean, there is some sense in which groups persist, but not in the way in which I myself as an individuated thing. And one of the special things about me as an individuated thing, which is different from if I were a rock or if I were a bicycle, is that I have this internal world that persists. So the personal identity theory that I like is this John Locke one, whereby I persist Rebecca, even though the little bits of my body change, because I know what it was like to be me yesterday, and that me knew what it was like to be me the day before. I don't know what the central knowing thing that the football team is there. It's the individuated members who have these things, these capacities to do stuff like their knowledge. So the problem is, even if I accept that the group persists over time in this sense, that doesn't really help with the idea that the group has a collective consciousness, in any sense more than each of the things has a consciousness. And then they can come together and deliberate in this sense of deliberating between members as opposed to within each individuated member. But anyway, I mean, this is a very, very big.
May I add something? Artificial intelligence already, to some degree of accuracy, can create, ready for this word, an avatar of a real human being, thus somewhat spiritual and possibly existing after the biological death of the person. However, large language models that I've been using a lot recently to combine text from an individual with text from another individual can produce whatever the plural of avatar is, something that represents a subculture, if not a full culture. For example, I've often recently taken a Wikipedia biography, large text biography of a famous person, put it into ChatGPT, and then had conversations with him or her.
Yeah,
and so the individual, the small group, the subculture, the society, all of these are real, but maybe not God's.
Yeah, I'm just not sure why I would think, though, that using the information from a biography to create some simulation of that person would be in any sense the persistence of that person. Similarly, any other kind of simulation of me, I just don't think that's going to be me. I think
well, again, in my presentation, I refer to the use of tens of thousands of questions in questionnaires filled out by the individual. And indeed, a process over which the individual has a degree of guidance over how it's done.
Right, but if I come across a questionnaire, I gave my grandfather a questionnaire when I was about 8. We had to talk to our grandparents about the war. And I remember asking my grandfather these questions about what he did in the war. If I were to come across the answers to those questions tomorrow, I don't think I'd be in any sense less sad about the fact that my grandfather died 20 years ago. I wouldn't think my grandfather exists anymore because I'd found the answers to his questions. I'd like to know that information again, but in the sense of my grandfather persisting, I'm not sure why I would think he persists, because the answers he gave have been interpolated into some very important and very impressive kind of technology that can help us learn things and know things.
This deviation from the scheduled path is very close to the interests of everyone here. So I think we could really keep discussing it for all the rest of the day. and forever. But yes, you are really drawing us in a direction that we find fascinating to discuss, but to stay on schedule. Unless someone has a really burning question for Rebecca that she should answer now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, none. I would like to thank you so much, Rebecca. It was a great talk, and I hope that we will continue to stay in touch. By the way, I'd like to thank Chris Kokinos for encouraging me to invite you. It was really a pleasure meeting you, and I look forward to reading everything that you have written. Let's stay in touch. Having said that, I see that the next speaker, who is Namrata, is here. I had mentioned the possibility to switch her with Angela because she told me that she might be late. But since you are here, how about we keep the original schedule, which is that you speak now and Angela speaks after you.
Yes, that's perfect. And thank you for being considerate. We had our academic year starting at Hopkins, and the program ended early, luckily for me. So yeah, thank you.
And very likely for us. Namrata, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So I have, as per the schedule, I have 30 minutes, right, Giulio?
More or less, we are flexible.
Okay, all right, thank you. So let me share my slides. Okay, I want to make this slideshow from the start. Okay, can you see my slides now in full form?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. So first of all, what a pleasure to be back. I've spoken on this forum before. And so when Julio reached out to me, I was absolutely honored. And Rebecca, I wish I had listened to your presentation because as you were speaking, I just wrote an article on the connection, astrophilosophy, the coming together of philosophy and strategy. But I looked at it from the perspective of China, India, the United States and other nations and how they think about space and the cosmos. So if you're interested, I can send it to you, and I would be very much interested in your work as well. So, and also in terms of your response to football, I'm an Argentina fan since 1986. A little heartbroken they lost, but their game was not, I thought didn't have an offensive game, and the better team won. But you know, it's always a heartache when the country and by the way, a lot of folks in Asia support Argentina. So they were awake, my God, at 2 or 3 in the morning to watch this game. So hats off to them. But anyway, so today what I have been asked to present on is on the concept of space security and defense, and connecting this to conceptual thinking. A little bit of my background. So right now I'm teaching space policy and strategy at School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University, for a program that Hopkins does with the United States Space Force. So I do teach this as a part of core curriculum to students at the master's, and I also have PhD students. And so this is a real passion of mine to understand this particular concept. Recently, I returned from Brunei in the Asia Pacific, where I taught this course to students from about 100 nations. So it was really interesting to also see how different nations view it. And they are different. And this is something that I always keep telling my students, that just because you think of space security in a particular way, someone in, say, Tonga or say Philippines might think of it very differently. So keep that in mind when I am presenting. So before I go on, I do have to say that everything I say is my own opinion and does not represent the perspective of the US government, the Department of Defense, US Air Force, or US Space Force. So in terms of the presentation, what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about what I mean when I use the term space security and strategy. Then I'll connect it to how space actually enables defense and military power, and that this kind of connection is not just in the US, it's across the world. The nation that started it was, of course, China. China was the first nation to think about military space power from an institutional perspective since 2015. And right now they have a very advanced understanding of how it projects power. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities and counter-space threats that we face. And then I'll have a chart in which I'll show you how all these different concepts connect. So a little bit about my definition. So when I use the term space security, I mean that particular capability that enables stability, which means that you have particular assets in space that enables a particular nation to have security, stability, as well as support of critical infrastructure. So the definition of space security is not only in regard to defense. It is a larger conceptual definition that includes, for example, weather forecasting, mapping of forest fires that we all were affected by over the weekend if you lived in DC and other areas that Canada suffered from, mapping of weather, looking at tornadoes, for example, if you're an island nation, tsunamis. So if you have that kind of capability, you actually have stability. And then, of course, in the last few years, there has been a great advancement of space security from the perspective of military. And I'll talk about that as well. And then access. When you think about space security, not all of us have access to space. We talk a lot about settlements. We talk about lunar and Mars infrastructure. Our book, Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space, was published in 2020 and talked a lot about nations' investment in space resources, for example, and concepts of human settlement. And there are actual programs in place across US, China. Now, India is starting to enter the game, Japan, in terms of how that will play out. But all of that depends on whether you have the ability to get to space. And not every nation has it. They can buy it from others, but it's not cheap. And I'll tell you this because I teach for the African Space Leadership Network. And one of the main points the students brought to my attention is that it's expensive to get to space. So it's easy to say that we all have access to space, but we actually don't. We might have folklore, conceptual, historical, fictional access, but when it comes to actual access, it's very hard. And that's something space security should talk about, and how can we actually bring that about. Why it matters, I already pointed it out, very much a part of our critical infrastructure. Most of us depend on space for so many things we do, including I use GPS today to get from one point to the other, and that makes our life easier and more efficient. And in my TED Talk that I gave in the Rosa Parks Museum, what I pointed out to my participants, because they asked me, why should I care, is that, well, actually you are enabling better, efficient use of, for example, gas emission. If you're lost and you have a longer way, you are polluting the environment much more than if you use GPS, which is much more efficient if you find that way. And then finally, for space, defense is very important. It's all about protecting and also supporting a capability that a particular nation might develop. Now, what is space security? I mentioned that to you already. As I mentioned, just to put my point again to you, it's not just military. It covers long-term sustainability. And most importantly, it also ensures that our space assets, be it launch, which can be targeted with cyber attacks, which happens very often. The Indian Space Research Organization was targeted, for example, by North Korean alleged non-state actors and got into one of their systems just before their moon mission. And that was a big scare for India. That can happen, and so you do have to understand that it's not just in space. Space systems can be targeted through many means, and one of them is cyber. It could be reversible dazzling. I'll talk a little bit about that more. The other thing which I think we need to think through is space security also is very much focused on safe behavior in space. So when we think about, say, natural debris that happens in space, I don't think we have a good map yet, understanding of radiation and what it can do to the human body. For example, if you live on the moon, understanding of reproduction, safely. Understanding all this is a part of space security discourse today. And there is very serious thinking about how can we ensure that nations do not engage in, say, anti-satellite weapon that they have, that they can, for example, a missile can attack a satellite that creates debris. There's a lot of serious discussion on how can we make that behavior absolutely not acceptable. And the United Nations has a resolution. Not many nations, especially those who can do it, have agreed. And that's something of a challenge because China, India, Russia, and the United States have that capability. And China, Russia vetoed that particular resolution in the UN that said that, no, we are not going to agree to a anti-satellite moratorium. So those are the discourses that are critical to the space security discourse because it's about keeping space usable and that nations that come after us or societies or our descendants are able to use space in a secure and safe way. The other thing that we have not really talked about is from a space security perspective, and this is a challenge, is that what happens if one nation gets to a particular area in space and establishes a settlement, and that is the area, say on the moon, the South Pole is seen as the most viable, and then does not allow another nation to be a part of it. And that has happened historically. And history teaches us that nations that somehow get to a particular area first have behaved in that manner. We might not like it, but that's what happens when you get to a particular area and because you have limited resources. So how do you deal with that? Can we actually anticipate that behavior today? And that's a part of space security discourse as well. Now, how is it connected to defense, which is the key question that Julio asked me to answer? So in some sense, it's connected because, as we see with defense strategies across the world, be it in the United States, be it in China, be it in India, Japan, European Union, African states like Nigeria and South Africa, they argue that defense strategies describe space as indispensable to military power because the military forces, rely on satellite communication, missile warning, especially those who have nuclear weapons. You very much want to know where the nuclear weapons are. You want to know if a nation is planning on using a nuclear weapon or is doing some kind of activity, like, for example, the big scare around Russia placing nuclear weapons in space that happened a few years ago. Russia denied it, but there was fear across the world. And so those are the kind of capabilities that space allows. And historically, if you think about it, most people don't realize this, that NASA was established during the greatest age of geopolitics, which is the United States versus the Soviet Union. So when the charter, if you look at the original charter, was established by the Eisenhower administration, and if you look at the debates around that time, space itself was a part of geopolitics. And the reason that the US got to the moon first and the Soviet Union got to space first with Sputnik and Human, I looked at the archive of the Soviet Union, it was a lot about national pride, national security. The fact that we are going to be there first will make us more attractive. So it was a lot of nationalism that resulted in the entire space capability that we have today. And so that's very important, and that continues today in a large extent. But I would argue that the capabilities have got much more efficient and much more stronger. Then the more important thing is, if you look at the discourse on the connection of space security to defense, I'm sure all of you have discussed this, the concept of planetary defense. So most defense-based strategy, especially if you look at the US defense strategy, talks about securing a stable and accessible domain that protects US, allied, and commercial space capability. I was in China doing fieldwork, and one of the things that the Chinese space scholars told me was that, well, we are also thinking about space security and defense from a planetary protection defense perspective. So they argued that, well, if an asteroid, God forbid, comes at us, and our historical examples tell us that because we didn't have that capability of deflection, asteroids did hit us, and we actually extinguish several species. Now, the human being as a species has a knowledge, And so how do you use that to have that kind of defensive capability that can use nuclear or any other capability that can deflect, say, a terrible attack or a terrible disaster, right? And so that's the kind of thinking that is also there when you come to think about space security and defense. And then finally, space defense is very much connected to deterrence. So for example, if you think about concepts like the Golden Dome today, people think the Golden Dome is inspired by the Iron Dome in Israel that deters, I wouldn't use deter, that defends missile attacks, say, on the Israeli homeland. And so the Golden Dome memo talked about a very similar kind of capability, for example, for the United States. Interestingly, China has announced their own such capability, and then India has argued that, well, we are also very fearful of missiles, say, coming from Pakistan, and Pakistan is saying similar things. We might need to develop very similar capability as well. So it's very much a part of the space security discourse if you think about how space security and defense are connected. It's the military dependence, protection mission, and the deterrence mission. So when you talk to military members across the globe, not just the US Space Force, I was actually quite surprised. I engaged with about 100 military personnel from the Asia Pacific. And the first thing I asked them is that, okay, what do you think when you think about space security and defense? They said it's about protection. I want to protect my community. I joined the military so that I can protect my nation, but also my community. And so it's very interesting, the motivations that lead some of these very young folks in their 20s and 30s today to be joining their space services, especially military space services. Now, why space matters? So if you think about it from an operational perspective, and this is what Julio asked me to talk about specifically. So when I use the word conflict dyads, what I mean is that there are certain conflicts in the world that are bilateral. So for example, China, India, as you know, have very deep conflict in the border areas. They are nuclear weapon states, which is a great fear that they might use nuclear weapons against each other. They have been disputing their borders for several decades now. I come from the region in India that is claimed by China. And so historically, China has attacked India. In 1962, they attacked India and India lost, but China went back, did not stay in those territories. But they continue to, China-India continues to have conflict in that area. Now, what happens is that both China and India are now pointing out that if you have space capability, you can actually have warning if another nation's military is in our area, which they didn't have before they thought about space capability. Another conflict dyad is South Korea and North Korea. As you know, North Korea continues to test intercontinental ballistic missiles and a short-range missile. And the nation that is most concerned about this is South Korea and Japan. Because God forbid, if North Korea tests a missile and it does not fall into the Sea of Japan and falls over Tokyo, and don't forget, this is a nation that has been that nuclear weapon has been used against. So they have a big trauma about this. So that's a conflict dyad or a bilateral, trilateral conflict that we need to keep in mind. And then finally, of course, the larger tension that we see between China, Taiwan, China and the ASEAN nation, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that have several border conflicts today. China, of course, argues that these are all our areas and very unilaterally decides that, well, this is my area, your claim is not true, but then space is becoming a very critical part of mapping force movement into disputed areas, and nations are building that particular capacity. So why does space matter for defense at all? So if you see this particular graphic, this is from NATO. So NATO very recently declared space an operational domain. So did one of the greatest nations in Europe regarding space, France. France has access capability and also one of the most advanced in terms of building that kind of capability. The United Kingdom, Germany is starting to think about space as well. So they pointed out that, well, from a military perspective, space plays, and space is number one. Space plays that role that every other service, say cyber, air, land, or maritime uses. Now, if you see this particular diagram, this is nuclear command and control. So this is in geosynchronous orbit. So most importantly, what nations are talking about, and this is something not just in the US, but China, India, which are nuclear weapon states, and Russia, they said that, well, if somebody targets our nuclear command and control infrastructure in geo, that is a dangerous escalation. That means that they are preparing to attack us. So that's why, if you notice, nations are very careful when they are signaling to each other about space capability. And China has a no first use policy when it comes to targeting nuclear or using nuclear. India has a draft no first use policy, but the United States has a first use policy. So you see, there is a little bit of a difference even when it comes to thinking about space from a nuclear perspective. Now, why has this all come about? So before 1991, space was seen as a civilian infrastructure. Space was seen as inspirational, aspirational. We wanted to go to the moon. We wanted to go to low Earth orbit. We wanted to be able to build human civilization in space. That consciousness shift that we were talking about and discussing right before my presentation, in terms of what space means. There are very different cultural insights here. I was in a panel with the Navajo Nation that had a very different understanding of how space can be accessed and their own origin story. And by the way, almost all tribal communities in the world have origin stories about space, including the area I come from. And the Naga, one of the largest tribes in Northeast India, will challenge some other tribe that might say that our perspective is the only perspective that matters, right? So it's very interesting. But from a military perspective, the Gulf War of 1991 was that particular war that changed the idea of space for military forever. So I was very young during the Gulf War, but I remember my father telling me that during the Gulf War, 1991, space-enabled precision bombing was what gave the United States their victory. What happened was that for the first time, space capacity was able to look into Iraqi battle space, was able to identify targets, and was used in command and control, decision making, and that gave the US that advantage. Iraq did not have it. China was shocked when they saw this. And so in 1991 and 1996, China took a decision that, my God, if we don't invest in military space capacity, we are done for as a nation. And so they took a decision to build that capability. The other turning point was the 2022 Ukraine war. So if you all, and we are all living through it, it's still going on. Millions of people, thousands and thousands of people have been killed. Russia has lost more soldiers than Ukraine. But more importantly, the first step of the Ukraine war was an attack on a space system. They attacked the Viasat modems. So Russia attacked the modems because Viasat was being used by the Ukrainian military for command and control, for battlefield mapping. And so that was, they destroyed all the modems. And so Starlink had to come in. If you remember, SpaceX came in and offered command and control, but then that was challenged by Russia in the UN, saying that how can a commercial company be offering unsolicited military communication capability? And then SpaceX had to come out and say that, well, we meant it for humanitarian purposes. So the legal issues are still being challenged as to how can commercial companies be used for military when they do not have a contract, or there is no legal framework for that. And so that's something that is a very critical part of the discourse as well, and that has implication. More importantly, the idea of space in the defense world is shifting from enabling, which is that you use space for communication, you use space for intelligence gathering, to the fear that we might have battle in space by itself, by that attacking one nation's space system, which Russia signaled they would do if we target them in their homeland, and China has it in their doctrine as well. India is starting to think about it as well. So just to again come back to the point, what does space do? It offers visibility. You can see into the other nations' capability. If you are, especially for the United States Navy, because Japan, Taiwan, South Korea are allies, and I've been to Japan. Japanese society expects the US to come to Japan's support in case there is escalation. So the US has to have that kind of visibility and understanding of the battlefield. Otherwise, you will not be a good ally, right? Secondly, space offers persistent global surveillance and communication. And then finally, we're not there yet, it can offer real-time tracking. So you can know where a particular adversary or competitor, China can know that too. They have that capability today, but not real time. We are still not there. It's still a little delayed. So we are trying to with ground-based ground moving target indicator and air moving target indicator. Japan just announced that they're going to build that capacity. India is starting to build that, but we are not there yet. So it's a very interesting world that we are actually coming into with space and defense and security. Now, space is a warfighting domain. This is very contested and very, very controversial. So historically, especially in the United States, space has been viewed as a sanctuary. And this is not Carl Sagan's conception of sanctuary. Carl Sagan's conception of sanctuary was that human beings should not go to space. We should use machines, and we should not be polluting that environment. Dan Dudney, Dark Skies, who is a professor with me at Johns Hopkins, has a very similar view. Sanctuary here, from a military security perspective, is that you will be using space, but you cannot place weapons in space. You simply cannot, because it challenges the stability. It creates unnecessary tension. So from a military perspective, sanctuary has been very dominant till about 2015, when China announced their PLA strategic support force. And they argued that space is the strategic high ground. Space is a military domain, right? And then, of course, the United States supported their own establishment of the Space Force, France. Now we're having a lot of nations establishing it. So there has been a shift since 1991 with the Gulf War, and this got crystallized under President Xi in 2013. And now today, space is seen as a warfighting domain in our own American military domain perspective. So it's a doctrine, it's a policy, and that's what Space Force and other military personnel get to learn. And by that, they mean that space is not just about support. It is possible that another nation might attack our assets in space, and we have to be very, very prepared for that. Now, I mentioned this already. This was the strategic pivot for the United States to do this with the creation of the Space Force and Space Command in 2019. If you look at U.S. doctrine, there is a lot of written work from the U.S. military that I would encourage. It's very complex. It's not as simple. They talk about the importance of space superiority, by which they mean that we should be able to deter our assets, especially military assets, from being targeted. It's interesting that in the US, there is still no agreement on whether you should come to the security of your commercial assets. So if a SpaceX asset gets targeted, it's the US Department of War or the Space Force is not tasked to come to their rescue. China is different. Germany just took a decision that they will come to the rescue of their, it's like 911. If your neighborhood is attacked and your house is attacked, you can call up the police and they'll come, at least show up. We don't have that in space as yet. And we don't, it's deep implication in terms of security, governance, and especially for those nations that feel insecure, that they do not have someone they can turn to if something goes wrong. Now, as I mentioned this already, I don't want to belabor the point, but these are the missions that the Space Force has put out in their doctrine, that they want to protect the joint warfighting capability of the United States, defend all stakeholders, which also includes commercial, but they are not yet tasked to do that in the protect. Protect is very different than defend. And then, of course, connect with partners and allies. So this is a very critical part of the mission given to the US Space Force, that you cannot do it alone. You will have to build partners all across the world and allies that can help you in ensuring that space remains secure and that space is not used for purposes that you do not want space to be used for. Now, these are the capabilities I talked about, next generation capabilities that our services are talking about: real-time tracking, orbital maneuver, that you can move satellites. You know that it's very difficult to move spacecraft in space because of fuel. So the way spacecrafts are designed, they have very limited fuel. So we talk a lot about how we can move from one point in space to another, but our spacecrafts, unless you can do refueling, are not prepared for that today. And so if you look at lunar missions, they are designed in a way that you can do that maneuver because you have the fuel. But it's very limited, not the way that you can build human civilizations, right? Starship wants to be that particular vehicle. And so if that is achieved, and China's Long March 9 which has a capacity of 140 metric ton and will be reusable, is also trying to do that. And so that's something, so these are the next generation capabilities that we are looking at, and the reasons why we are basically looking at. And so I build this based on different insights and future, especially science-based assessments across the world, not just the US. And these are the things that nations are looking at, but they're not there yet. These are about 20, I would say 10 years in the making. The only thing that China was able to showcase is on-orbit refueling, and India too. They showcase it with the Zhejiang 21 and the Zhejiang 25 satellites, where they kind of docked with each other and refueled. So they are the only nation that have successfully shown such a capacity. Now, I talked about this, so this is what space enables, but these are the disruptors. Direct ascent anti-satellite weapon, laser dazzling. Nations like China and the US have this capability. India does not have it as yet. Jamming and spoofing, a lot of nations have that, and cyber intrusion. That happens on a daily basis. If you look at Space Force data, they'll tell you how much of disruptions they're actually fighting. And we don't hear about it because they're successful. So, and so that's something very, very critical when you think about space security and defense. So these are the effects that space has. Space allows us to observe, decide, orient, and act. So this is China. So US has a resilience-based perspective when it comes to space security and defense. China is very different. China thinks about systems destruction warfare. They have written a lot on this. Their argument is that, especially from the Chinese Academy of Military Sciences and the PLA, the documents I've seen, they argue that, well, because the US is so dependent on space and has mega constellation structures, one anti-satellite weapon will not do it. We'll need to build a systems destruction warfare capability that can degrade capability across low Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit, and so that we can have that particular advantage. And so they do have all the tools that I'm talking about today, and they're building even more. And their aim is to be able to have anti-access area denial. That's what A2AD means. And they want to degrade US sensing, targeting, and communication. And by the way, this is part of their doctrine. So because it's part of their doctrine, it's official. So it's not just media or just academics talking about it. They put it in their military strategic guideline. The United States has very similar doctrinal and national security perspectives as well. Russia. Now, Russia is a very interesting nation, and I thought it's important to think about Russia. Russia is different from US and China. So when you think about Russia, they're not really thinking about the systems warfare destruction capability that China is thinking about. They're not thinking about commercial. Russia has a very weak commercial sector, but they do have very good national security focus, and they are focusing on counter space capability. Disruption, inspector satellites, they have that. They have anti-satellite weapon capability, and they also have cyber capability. And the core logic, if you look at Russian doctrine, is to offset US conventional superiority, especially by threatening of US orbital services. So the one thing I've recognized looking at different nations is that regimes really fear that someone might threaten them, especially when they are not democratic, when they're authoritarian, like China Communist Party or Russia under Putin. And one of the biggest things they want to showcase is that if you're thinking about changing our regime, we can target you. So please do not think about that, right? So it's a little bit of a signaling, but they also have that kind of capability. So they're very much focused on strategic deterrence. So this is the way I will look at their different capabilities: China, Russia, and the United States. So finally, this is what I'm going to say is that if you think about all these capabilities, this is what they're hoping to build. In terms of space security and defense. Low Earth orbit capability, which is different from middle Earth capability, which is also different from geosynchronous orbit. And so these are the different doctrinal approaches that the United States, China, and Russia has. For the US, it's a lot about resilience, integration, joint operation. For China, it's a lot about systems destruction. So they're thinking about it in a much more holistic manner. And for Russia, it's a lot about the ability to showcase to the adversary that we have a capability. So be careful when you think about invading our homeland. By the way, this is a very real threat for Russia because of Ukraine. Because the US and West have supported Ukraine, the Russian fear is that if we are losing there, they might attack our homeland, despite the fact that we are a nuclear weapon state. So, and this comes from their strategic culture, as I point out, what threats allies and their elites actually think about, right? These are some of the risk structures that space security and defense thinks about, that if you're dependent on a very few satellites, you might be totally not representing your nation. One thing that I always try to think through when I teach my students or also from the military is that what are they tasked with by the Constitution? Not just in the US, but across the world. What are we demanding of them, right? What are they looking at day to day? They're basically looking at meeting US national interests and constitutional obligation. For the Indian military, it's about ensuring that India's national power and territorial integrity is intact. For the Chinese military, it's about Communist Party of China legitimacy and the fact that China is a part of that particular legacy, modern China since 1949. And given that task, this is what they are really scared about, that they might not be able to do. And because we demand so much of them as a society, that's what our military services across the world think about. Their own nation, how they can secure their own citizens, and then finally, they are tasked to do this, right? It's an order, so you have to do it. So it's a very interesting we teach ethical dilemma as well that you have to face when you're tasked with such capabilities. This is the escalation ladder I worry about in space, and I think this is something that I try to tell my audience that it can escalate very quickly. And this is what history teaches us, right? We think about when we attack space, it'll be very reversible. We can change it. It's not that bad. But, if it gets to the nuclear level, that's an escalation that might get out of control. If you attack someone's nuclear command and control, they might misunderstand. If you looked at the archive during the US-Soviet era, the Soviet kernel, there was the system gave a warning that the US had launched a nuclear missile at Russia. And there was this one colonel who decided that this was an error. And we were saved, I would say. And these are archived, And so that kind of decision making, it's very critical. And we need to be very careful when we think about the connection between these capabilities. So I already talked about the Golden Dome. So I will end with this and open it up for discussion. So some areas that I think space security and military thinking is not yet getting to is what happens when we expand human civilization to the moon and beyond, right? What kind of identity will be formed? Will our understanding of space security and defense, are we actually cognitively prepared to deal with that? I mean, science fiction series like The Expanse, which shows you geopolitical conflict, Dune, and Dune is such a great example of houses, differences, Star Trek, Star Wars, Chinese science fiction like Dark Forest, Indian science fiction. We are thinking about it in a science fiction perspective, but are we taking those warnings seriously that some authors have so wonderfully put before us? I just heard a question on artificial intelligence. That's something I don't think we're thinking through. What happens when we have artificial intelligence with super intelligence, like Nick Bostrom talked about, where AI has the brain capacity to take decisions autonomously? We are not there yet, right? So what happens then? What happens when AI decision-making leads to escalation that I talked about? Lunar infrastructure is emerging as we speak. China has the best relay infrastructure in the far side of the moon. We don't have it. The US doesn't have it. India doesn't have it. What happens when most nations will build that capacity? And then finally, this is the area I think is not being discussed, which is the Lagrange points on the moon. So the only nation with a capacity in Lagrange L2 is China. China has a relay satellite here. They can look to the far side of the moon. And so they're able to support their missions real time. What happens when that escalates? Do we have the legal framework to deal with it? So yeah, so I'll end there and I open it up for questions, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Namrata, this is a great lecture of what has happened and what is happening now in the sector of space defense, leading to the content of the last few of your slides that target the future. I'm afraid that we don't have time for an extended discussion, but I'd like to ask you to give us a short answer to a simple question. What is the military value of the moon?
Yeah. So, two. One, if you are able to build space situational awareness in cislunar space, which is the ability to have a good map, right? One value is that you can actually be able to then look down. And this is what one of China's major designer for their lunar program put out a really interesting paper, I think last year, where he pointed out that with China's capacity, they can actually now build that map, not just for cislunar space, which starts about 36,000 kilometers to about 240,000 kilometers, but they can look down. So they can actually see what assets the US and others have in geosynchronous orbit. And that's a big military utility if you have a capability to do that, right? The second one, which I think in terms of military utility. So when I see a military service, I see it as especially because I lived in democratic nations. India, the largest democracy, and then the US, now the modern, oldest democracy. Military services exist to support civilian infrastructure, and war fighting is not their only. They also do disaster response. They also rescue people when in disaster. You'll be surprised that almost all disasters in Asia, it's the military that responds first. They are the first ones that secures people and saves them, right? So in some sense, if you have capacity on the moon, where you have, say, let's take a hypothetical scenario, you have an American base with Artemis and human settlement, and you have a space force that is enabled to actually rescue and respond to disaster, fix communication, which NASA is not really built for. NASA does not have a service that can go and rescue you real time, especially if there is a threat. So I think those are the utilities. And just to end, if you're interested, I have written a whole article on this it's called the US Space Force and the Utility of Cislunar Space. So I kind of draw out my arguments there.
Thank you very much. And I'd like very much if you could send me the link to that paper, because I have not read that one. We have time for one more question to Namrata, if anyone has one. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. No question, and thank you so very much. Great lecture. And
thank you.
Lots of information packed in half an hour. So I'd like to move to the next speaker, who is Angela. And Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giulio. And I just want to start off by thanking you for organizing this event, also Martine and Gabriel and the entire Terasem community for creating a really unique space where we can ask about like the future of humanity in outer space, off planet. Like what a cool thing to be able to do that. In preparing for today's gathering, I started off with a slide deck, and the more I thought about it, I realized I really just wanted to talk to you guys and share my perspective, my thinking, my sense making on all of this stuff. I think it's great that I'm coming after Namrata, 'cause she did a great job talking about like what's actually happening, like how we're taking, territorial nationalism, fighting, killing. We're taking that off planet. We're taking the nation state model to a whole new place where there are no nations yet. And so what I really want to talk about is, well, what's possible? Like how could we maybe rethink what we're doing and make it more cooperative and make it more humane? So I really just kind of want to share a story about what led me to asking that type of question and how my thinking has evolved. And this is just my vantage point, this is shaped off of 15 years working in the US federal government, studying leadership, studying human development and human potential, studying polymathy as a human phenomenon, which is about being really interdisciplinary and really intelligent, thinking about collective intelligence, and now thinking about humanity's future off Earth. And I'm not here because I think I've solved self-governance off the planet. I'm here because I think we need more people who think in new ways about what's possible as we become a multi-planet species. And at the end of my talk, near the end of my talk, I'm going to put a straw man on the table just to get something new out there so that we don't assume that we must take our dysfunctional nation-state behaviors off Earth. So if you agree with, or if you disagree with me today, great. If you think my model has blind spots, great. I would love for you all to really think. And my hope is not that you'll agree with me. My hope is that you leave my talk with bigger questions, with wondering what is possible. All right, so to explain why I want to talk about the future of civilization off Earth, I need to go back to where my journey started. And so this is going to be a little bit like a story time, okay? So my story starts in Berkeley, California, where I was born. Berkeley is the land of hippies and woo-woo and human potential, and that is infused in part of me. But I also attended Christian schools from preschool to 12th grade. So I have that sort of stream of thinking braided into me. And one of the things I really took from all that Christian schooling was how beautiful the golden rule is, to treat other people like you would like to be treated. And all that Christian indoctrination really did have an impact on me. And I believed that it was a good thing to live a life of service. Like, how could I use my human life to somehow be helpful, to be of service? And back when I was a teenager, my naive thinking was, well, if I want to live a life of service and really make a positive impact in the world, then I should work in government. I was so naive, but that was my plan. So when I was 18, between high school and college, I interned for the governor of California. And then when I was in my master's program, I landed a White House internship. And that turned into a career in the federal government. My first job out of school was as a non-political civil servant at the executive office of the president. So I met Bush, I've met Obama, I've met Biden. I've never met Trump, and I'm okay with that. But I've been able to see government from the state level, at the presidential level. But one of the things that I've also been really passionate about was just human potential. Like, how can we each become the best version of ourselves possible? And how can we collectively become the best version of our human potential? And how could that ripple out and make the world a better place? So after 6 years at the executive office of the president, I transferred over to another part of the federal government called the Center for Leadership Development. And our mission at the Center for Leadership Development, it was a beautiful mission. Our mission was to develop visionary leaders to transform government. And I thought, wow, that is such a cool mission. I want to be a part of that. And I spent nearly a decade managing leadership development programs for learners from across the entire federal government. But here's the hard truth. After a decade of that work, the truth is we failed that mission. We never transformed government. We never did. The hard truth is you can't install an agile, visionary leadership software onto a legacy, industrial era, bureaucratic operating system. The system's architecture is literally designed to resist change. That's what bureaucracy does. So I was frustrated by not being able to make a real difference in government the way I had hoped. And I started a doctoral program at George Washington University because I wanted to really understand, what does human thriving at its best look like? So I studied polymathy. That's a word a lot of people don't know, even though it's an ancient term from ancient Greece. Polymathy means many learnings. It's about not being boxed in, not limiting your consciousness. It's becoming expert in multiple disciplines, being mentally free and highly capable, good at learning. So I studied how humans learn, how they blossom into their fullest potential, how they master multiple disciplines. Martine Rothblatt is a quintessential example of a powerful, capable, modern day living polymath. She used her intelligence for good. She still does. And it's really exciting work. Like, I have talks at Mensa, the High IQ Society. I have talks for the Federal Innovators Network. There's so much cool stuff happening. At the same time that I've studied like human potential and human intelligence at its best, I also spent 5 years deeply studying America's criminal justice system. And what I found there really broke my heart. You know, I went to government because I thought it was a force for good in the world, and that's how I could make a positive impact. But when I really looked under the hood of our justice system, I realized it was our legacy system at its ugliest, at its worst. Human potential was being systematically crushed. We have mass incarceration. Earth, if you took all the prisoners on Earth, America is less than 5% of the global population, but we have 25% of planet Earth's prisoners here in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And it is modern day slavery. It says so in our Constitution that if you call someone a criminal, the government can enslave them, and it's deeply racist. And it's really important that we start telling the truth about those legacy systems and that we don't export them off planet. Since I met the Rothblatts and they've been into, space discussions, I started exploring it myself and wondering, how humans will show up out there. And I realized that space is going to need some form of self-governance, some form of management. And I mean, how many of you think that our earthly systems of self-governance are perfect or functional or healthy? And I'm guessing it's none of you. So if we're not careful, we are just going to export our earthly bureaucratic dysfunctions off planet, like spreading a virus we have here, a sickness we have here off planet. Look at the systems that we have on Earth. They're built on high friction geopolitical rivalries. Are we going to blindly export those same competitive, tribal, us versus them, murderous templates into the cosmos? Or are we going to step into our true evolutionary destination, which, as Terasem teaches, requires cooperation, diversity, unity, and joyful immortality? So we need to start having respectful, honest, rigorous debates and even simulations, I think, about how we self-organize as a human species. And I've developed a straw man model, which I'll share now. Give me a second while I pull this up. Okay, can you all see my screen? Okay, good. So I don't believe that this is like the final model, the perfect model. It's just something to get the conversation going. So you'll see in this image, we have three sides of a triangle. One is we have direct democracy. So we have qualified citizens, and we don't, in this model, just to throw it out there, we don't vote for people or parties, we vote on issues. And each of these three elements of this model would have subcommittees focused on needs and issues. To vote on an issue as a citizen, you must make a pledge to not be ignorant. You must commit to educating yourself on the issues, and you must be willing to justify your vote publicly. And if you aren't willing to do that basic intellectual work, you shouldn't be voting. We also have expert panels and advisory committees. These representatives would be selected strictly based on the specific issues at hand and their qualifications. We need highly collaborative, multidisciplinary thinkers, the best and the brightest polymath geniuses amongst us who can work together to design solutions which are intelligent and holistic. And the goal would be for the experts and the people to be able to agree. And if they can't, then we need a tiebreaker. And I propose that we have an ethical leader or maybe a committee of ethical leaders who are that tiebreaker. And they would only step in to break deadlocks between citizens and experts. They would be chosen specifically for their high morality, their empathy, and their willingness to listen to diverse audiences. We would have zero tolerance for corruption. If they're found to be self-serving or if cronyism is found, that they would be removed. I'm going to stop sharing now. All right. So the mission of this model, I believe, honestly, any government, any organizing body or organized body of humans, any organization, I think, should participate in a singular mission. And I propose that that mission be to reduce suffering and enhance thriving of all conscious sentient life, not just humans, not just our respective tribes. We have to decide if we will continue to compete and harm, or if we will opt to intelligently cooperate instead. And especially given that outer space is hostile to us flesh beings, maybe it's a real opportunity for us to evolve as a human species beyond competition and towards cooperation, beyond nationalism, and towards just being part of the human species. We're literally building a new world out there. But to build a new world in space, maybe we also need to build a new way of thinking. So we could use space as our ultimate experimental sandbox. We could prototype and simulate brand new self-governance models, try them out there, and see what works. And if it works out there, who knows, maybe we could even use it back here on Earth to heal our broken systems that we have here. So, what does our future look like if we finally have the courage to self-organize around what's true, around collective, decentralized, and reintegrated intelligence, around empathy and compassion and human potential? I'm not seeking out agreement with this particular model. I'm hoping that we can collectively pressure test it and maybe discover a better alternative together. All right, so that's what I think. That's what I wanted to say. That's a little bit about me and how I arrived at this model. I can tell you, having worked inside the American federal government, it's highly dysfunctional. I've traveled to about a quarter of the countries on Earth. There's on a spectrum of dysfunction as well. There's room for improvement, and maybe we shouldn't just blindly let our models here infect other planetary bodies, and we should rethink how we govern ourselves as a human species. So with that, I would like to have a discussion with you all. So I'm going to throw out a few questions, and if anyone would like to answer any of these questions, let me know. I'll even put them in the chat. But first, I'm going to read them to you. Question 1 is, imagine that humanity is founding its very first settlement beyond Earth, and you have a blank slate. What is one principle of Earth's governance that you would absolutely preserve? Or what is a principle that you would intentionally leave behind? How can we learn from the mistakes of the past? Does anyone have any thoughts on that question?
I do, Angela. I was already having this thought, but I think your question really helps frames it really well, which is, I think it's interesting that and I'm personally very optimistic about that, observing particularly this colloquium and this conversation One thing that I found just really fascinating is having like three, just really brilliant geopolitical, conversations by yourself, Namrata, and Rebecca. And I think that in itself is just like a huge shift from what we've seen in the patriarchal colonial development of the world as is. All of the systems that we're working from, right? And so, going colonizing, the genocide. I mean, throughout all this process and development, like no one stopped and asked the woman like their opinion, right? And so as we're having this conversation about like where are we going next, I actually think it's just incredible that it's being grounded by, brilliant perspectives from women, which is not something we had like going into the last, run and creating the systems we have now. So that's my answer.
I think
Namrata, I see your hand.
Namrata.
Yeah, I loved your presentation, by the way. Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you.
So, one thing that I would take with me is the post-colonial states' capacity to give the right to vote to everyone immediately. I know in the other nations, the women got it much later. So that's something I'll take with me. And what is it that I would intentionally leave behind? Uh, one of the core tenets of any settlement is education. And I think the expensive way we do education, especially here, where many of us do not have the same level playing field, and where you go really matters, is something I think really hinders progress, right? And this is something I would, and it's people don't realize, but education, the way we are taught, really is a part of the governance system as well, you know?
Yeah,
And
government is in charge of education.
yes,
And look, they still got legacy models in the
yes.
AI revolution. They still haven't updated. I'm
Uh,
heavily involved with education reform
oh,
through the
I'm
human
delighted.
intelligence movement as well. My doctorate's in education. So
Oh,
yeah,
that's
we got to
fantastic.
update that.
We got to leave that
Absolutely.
behind. We got to build something, as you said, learn from history and learn not to do things terribly, you know? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. I think I saw another hand up. Did I?
Perhaps Thomas?
Okay. I'm going to ask another question. If you had to write one sentence describing the purpose of civilization itself, I propose that the purpose should be to reduce suffering and enhance thriving of all sentient beings. That's what I think we should be doing. But what is the purpose of civilization? I'm going to put the question in the chat as well. What do you think of my proposal to reduce suffering and enhance thriving of all sentient beings? Or is it to compete and to power grab? Because right now, power seems to be the name of the game. Is there a better
Well,
purpose?
I would say, let me put on my, I hope I am on video. Yeah. Okay. So for me, the purpose of civilization is to be able to offer meaning in what you do. I think that's a civilizational hope. I don't know if you've read this book by Stephen Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. He
I've heard of it.
documents, yeah, he documents the long history of us, how we have evolved and where we've come. And he said that actually we're doing better and depending because his arc is very, very long, right? So I would say purpose would be to find meaning. And you made that point, or not you, Rebecca made this point that while you have a football team, individual excellence and coming together really matters. And I think that's if in one line, find meaning.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, we're by nature, we're storytellers and sense makers. So living a meaningful life definitely matters to us humans. Anyone else have a feedback on this question? If you had to write one sentence describing the purpose of civilization itself, what would it be?
I'd like to throw one out, like maybe like communal problem solving and like awareness.
Hmm. Yeah, like a decentralized, collaborative sense making. Okay, I'm going to ask another question. What if the greatest purpose of space settlement isn't escaping Earth, but learning how to become a wiser civilization? Can you guys see that we're transporting our earthly models off planet? Can you see that our models are dysfunctional? Can you see that if we chose a better model off planet, maybe it would serve as an example and a sandbox for how we could make Earth better, wiser, more humane, more intelligent, more cooperative?
I have a comment on that. It's not really that I want to propose a solution, but you said, and I don't disagree, that our governance systems on Earth are dysfunctional. And especially, you don't seem to have a very high opinion of the governance system in your country. And I don't disagree on that either. Now, perhaps moving to space can help. I hope it will. But do we have any example here on this planet which is something you would consider functional and worth exporting
Yeah.
into space? Not necessarily a government system, but perhaps a political thinker, a political philosophy. We need a guide. Whom should we
Yes.
follow? And whom should we take with us into space?
Yes. Oh gosh, this is such an intelligent point, and it's such an intelligent question, Julia, because there are countries who get things right. Like I looked very deeply at the criminal justice system in America, but Norway is considered to have the best justice system on earth for a variety of reasons. They have low recidivism, which is repeat of crime. So they actually rehabilitate people so that they don't commit more crime and harm more people. And they do it through a very humane, evidence-backed way. There are like another function of government, as Namrata pointed out, is education. Now, the US, with all our money, our education is actually pretty poorly performing. We incentivize students to do what they're told, memorize, and not actually think. And I think Singapore is an example of a country who has much better educational outcomes. And so I think it would behoove us as a human species to actually look at, well, what are the things that need to be sort of centrally organized by a government body? What are those functions? Or what are the basic human needs everybody has? Like everyone needs housing, clean water, food. You know, there's food systems here in America for profit. We're like the fattest, most unwell country on earth because we monetize everything here, even food, which is necessary for life. But there are other countries and other models who do it more intelligently and more humanely. So I think it would be really smart to look at what humans need, what governments should be doing, what are they competent at, and how can we learn from the best government models across a variety of needs, and then maybe take that off planet, take those models. So we're actually learning from not just the mistakes of humans on Earth in the past, but from what we've done well here and take that off planet.
When
Yes.
it comes to political philosophies, now perhaps reflecting on this point can be useful. I mean, I do like very much some aspects of libertarianism, but perhaps paradoxically, I also like very much some aspects of socialism or social democracy. So, if you ask me to define myself politically, I would say that perhaps I'm a libertarian socialist, but most people don't seem to even understand what that would mean. Now, is the question that I ask you, what would a libertarian socialist be? And who should his or her intellectual maître pensée be?
Hmm.
Whose philosophers should we libertarian socialists follow?
Honestly, I don't know how to answer that question, but what I will say is that we've had a variety of different models, like you pointed out, Julia. We've had libertarianism, socialism, democracy, communism. There are different models of self-governance. And each of them means well, but falls short. Even democracy falls short.
Yes.
And so I think what we as a human species need to do is have an honest conversation without being allegiant to any model in particular. What can we learn about the strengths of each of these models and the weaknesses? My mother is an immigrant from a communist country, from Cuba. I still have family there. And it meant well, but it damaged the country. And that's the truth. And what can we learn from that? I think that's a much more interesting conversation to have, like to really look at that. All right, I'm going to put one. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think this is a very good point. Realizing that many systems mean well but fall short, or saying it the other way, many systems fall short but mean well. I think that's a very important realization. And as you say, perhaps we should study the strengths and weaknesses of all the systems instead of getting ideologically polarized. Let's move with the last question to the audience. That should be the last, so we can keep the time.
Yes. And I just want to say, having come from government, I don't think we can actually rely on governments to ask these big questions or to design the new model. The actors embedded in those government machines are embedded and incentivized to keep those bodies going. So I think it's up to us, the people, to reimagine what could be possible and to move those questions forward. All right, one more question before I wrap up my segment here. 1,000 years from now, what do you hope our descendants say was the wisest governance innovation of the 21st century? Time when AI is coming to the masses, maybe there's something we can do with AI, distributed, reintegrated intelligence. I hope we make our governance models humane, not just intelligent, but wise. We have lots of intelligence can be used to justify atrocities. You know, like wisdom is not automatic. Humanity is not automatic. We have to require that of our systems. So I hope there's a turning point we as a species have where our systems of self-governance become more conscious, more humane, more kind, more cooperative, more heart-centered. Namrata?
Yeah, oh, what a great question to contemplate. So when when India got independence, and Gandhi did not participate, you know that, right? In the Day of Independence, because he had written this whole treatise on how the modern state is very brutal. And why, he explained, right? So given that, and given Nelson Mandela and others thinking on what could be that we can leave for our descendants, I would say, besides a wise governance innovation, the one thing that and you said that, right, bureaucracies, because after all, one thing we don't realize is that even if I'm voting, I'm putting someone in power, it's the bureaucracies that run the system, right? The representatives do not, unless they are states people or they have been there for a long time, but they become a part of the bureaucracy. So the one innovation I don't know if we can get there, but I have been thinking about it, is an adaptive governance structure that can adapt to the times, right? We are always complaining that somehow our consciousness is moving ahead and our systems are not. So what is that template that can enable that, right? So it's not a very satisfactory answer, but this is a deep question. I have to think through it even more. So thank you.
It's really too bad that we cannot continue this discussion as long as it would need. But, I see that someone is entering the waiting room now. Now, I said already that Chris Kokinos is not going to be able to come. And I think I have one bad news, that I don't think that even Rick Tomlinson is going to be able to make it because he hasn't shown up yet. But I have a good news that Rick Tomlinson doesn't seem to be coming, so that we have the time for a good final talk by Robert Geraci, who is the last speaker. And by the way, I will encourage you all to read his last book. I have a review of the book in the Journal of Personal Cyber Consciousness, but instead of telling me my impressions, I will ask Robert to tell us about the real thing. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I spent last week, I'm just going to go play the screen sharing game. I spent last week in Korea, and so that meant I was jet lagged all last week. And now that means I'm jet lagged all this week, now that I'm back in the US. So please forgive me if I'm like a little lower energy than I might normally want to be. While but I got a PowerPoint here. We'll go ahead and make it bigger, I think. All right, I assume that worked for everybody. But let me know if it didn't work. Yeah, so this really does kind of fit into the context of what everybody else has been saying, and especially with this idea from start to finish about what kind of future we're trying to look for and what we're trying to produce, especially as we move forward with technologies that would take us into space. And it's worth noting, Giulio and he and I have interacted a long time. Bill Bainbridge and I have interacted a long time. So they both know that in some sense, my career from 20 years ago, I was really interested in kind of commenting on what I was seeing in the relationship between technology and culture and trying to be as neutral as I possibly could be. Nobody is actually neutral. And so what began with a project of let me just talk about things that I find interesting, and a way in which I thought, let's figure out what's going on in the world, has become somewhat more committed on my part. That now I have some sort of a more theologically oriented worldview on some of this. And largely it's because I think some of the people who are in this space, this cultural space, are pretty problematic and aren't likely to lead us in very productive directions, right? When you have leaders of tech companies who cannot be trusted to say even the most basic things truthfully, then that becomes problematic for me when those are the people building the technologies we're going to use. So I guess this Future Proofing Humanity book was in some sense an effort to kind of join the conversation, not just as a observer, but as someone who perhaps had something to say, which I think might resonate with what some of y'all have said. Now, I expect everyone here is kind of, there's nothing that's going to be particularly shocking about this timeline that I just sort of slapped a bunch of kind of books and essays at Gemini and let it create this not that awesome picture of various kinds of landmark essays that had come out over the last century or so. But the kind of key there is just to think that this is a long conversation. When we go back to someone like Nikolai Fyodorov, he was already talking about how space travel was part of this picture, right? That whatever the future of humanity was, it involved us going into space. And so there's been a long series of conversations about what human beings were going to do. And I'll just make one comment, which I find it endlessly entertaining how many of the people, not just on this list, but how many of the people I've read over the last 20, 25 years who think that we might want to have tails again in the future. That like regaining the tail is somehow a goal that everyone who talks about genetic engineering especially brings up. But this really comes from a perspective in which people are recognizing that human beings haven't been here all that long on the earth. And when we haven't been here all that long, that implies that we might not be here all that long, right? So that we are currently in a position where we may well drive ourselves extinct, right? And if we don't drive ourselves extinct, something else might, the asteroid that's big enough and, Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck can't save us from it or whatever. And or a super volcano, that erupts and causes so much damage to the biosphere that we can't sustain humanity. But we're also really, we seem pretty committed ourselves to this project of killing ourselves. And sometimes interestingly, it's the same people who think the technologies are awesome who are also telling us the technologies are awful, right? We see, there was a recent New York Times article about people in Silicon Valley who are worried about becoming the permanent underclass, right? So they're hustling through their AI, to develop these AI technologies and to be part of that and to make enough money that when it all comes to fruition, they themselves have money to live on, right? So they kind of actively see themselves as sabotaging the economy for everyone, right? And the P doom numbers among AI researchers are kind of surprisingly high. The people who are building AI are like, there's about a 40% chance the AI is going to kill us all. If that's true, if you really think there's a 40% chance, nearly 50-50, that we all die as a result of AI technology, and you continue to be part of that process, there's something kind of deeply wrong with you, right? Like that's really unproductive. Now, the reality of it is probably most people don't really think there's a 50-50 shot of AI annihilating humanity. But nevertheless, it's what a recent survey of about 850 tech engineers, computer software and computer engineers folks had kind of come down on. So anyway, there's this problem of existential risk, right? And this isn't a problem that's going to come as any great shock to anyone. This term existential risk floats all around these days. And it is that risk that we ourselves might not make it very long, right? And it seems like every time we turn around, we're finding new ways to potentially add to those risks, right? Whether it's a climate breakdown where, say, honeybees go extinct. Without honeybees, a whole bunch of the agriculture that human beings consume would fail, right? Or if we fish the oceans to the point that they become unsustainable, and then if we do that, then populations lose their access to food and what have you. Excuse me. And of course, we're very committed to things like, genetic engineering for good reason, right? There's lots of good things that might come of genetic engineering, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that a bioengineered virus could plausibly kill all the people. Some people here are old enough to remember when those guys in Australia had been experimenting with small mouse pox. And they were trying to render mouse pox harmless to mice. And what they actually produced was a mouse pox that was even more lethal. It was 99% lethal to mice. So they weren't trying to make a mouse pox that was just going to kill all the mice. That's what they came up with, though. So it's entirely possible to bioengineer a virus that could plausibly be lethal to human beings without us even intentionally doing it. And that puts aside those questions of security and defense and war, in which it's entirely plausible that people have an active interest, in doing such a thing. So in the book, Future Proofing Humanity, I kind of begin with some history of transhumanist thought and what's at stake in our relationship to our technology. And then I go through various technologies, right? Spend a chapter on genetic engineering to talk about the ways in which that might be crucial to our future or dangerous to our future, right? In both cases. But there's a long history of people trying to produce, what I should have put in this slide was a picture of a naked mole rat, right? Because Ilya Mechnikov in the 19th century was working on naked mole rats, because the curious thing about a naked mole rat, if you don't know this, is that they live their entire life, they grow to adulthood, and then they live their entire lifespan without aging. And then they just die, right? And Mechnikov felt like, well, if a naked mole rat can do that, a person could do that. So we need to figure out how to make it so people can just not age, right? And then you've got, contemporary versions of that, and people like Brian Johnson who are trying to figure out how to adapt themselves to live not just 120 years, but 500 years, 1,000 years, and so on. And there is some reason to believe these kinds of things could be possible because in research on other species, we have been able to extend their lifespans, right? Cynthia Kenyon quintupled the life of C. elegans worms, through genetic shifts that we wouldn't want in a human being, but nevertheless, it worked. And so there's at least some reason to believe that maybe we could genetically expand the lifespan of a human being. Maybe even eliminate aging as a process altogether. Most of you surely know Ray Kurzweil's work, and he loves to talk about longevity escape velocity, that we're going to get to a point where medical science is giving us back a year for every year we age, and then eventually it would actually give us back more than a year for every year we age, and then we would, end the process of aging. But the genetic engineering isn't just about living a long time, and it's not even just about kind of superhuman people, right? And there's a tradition there, right? A long tradition, decades long, of talking about how to augment humanity, but it's also about augmenting the environment. Colossal Biosciences has been working on these kind of resurrection projects, right? It's not exactly a resurrection because they take a living, say a wolf, and then they add some DNA that they know to have come from a dire wolf. And now what we really have is a hybrid of an ancient dire wolf and a contemporary wolf, but it's pretty close to a dire wolf, right? So they're kind of resurrecting these species. And that includes things like an effort to resurrect a woolly mammoth, in large part because that's a collaboration with this guy in Siberia, Zimov, who's got this project called Pleistocene Park, where he actually wants to restore the Pleistocene era tundra to this huge aspect of Siberia. And the purpose of that is actually to fight climate change. It's not because he just happens to like tundra or something. It's because he thinks if we can compress and control carbon in the permafrost, and right now the release of carbon in the permafrost is a major concern for all of us. He thinks that if we could restore that Pleistocene era environment, that would be productive, but he needs large herbivores, and mammoths traditionally would have been there, right? So genetic engineering is one technology that's relevant. Another and obvious technology that we've all seen over and over again is these AI technologies, right? And the language around producing human equivalent AI is not new. It's been pervasive for the last 75 years within science, and longer if you count science fiction, right? And fiction storytelling. And if you count religious storytelling, then you probably have about 2,000 years worth of people talking about building a human equivalent artificial life, right? But in the contemporary world, what's been happening here in the late 20th and early 21st century has been people talking about exponential curves of progress, right? They look at, things like how awesome our computers are getting and, how quickly, and they go, well, that's just going to happen forever, or at least it's going to happen to some point where we get magical, amazing technologies, right? You all know all this. And if, in fact, at some point that exponential curve really takes off the way people like Hans Moravec and Ray Kurzweil predicted, then we might upload our minds into machines and live forever and so forth. We might evolve into some new state, right? And most of the advocates of this position argue that this is, in fact, baked into kind of the laws of nature. Moravec, the roboticist, he used to talk about evolution, that evolution was weeding out ineffective forms of thought, and that evolution was going to move from biology to a kind of synthetic, technical form of life. Ray Kurzweil would talk about the law of accelerating returns, a law which he's kind of retconned in his most recent book. His earlier books, he very clearly states it applies to all of like the universe. And in his most recent book, he's like, no, I never said that. All I said was it's just about, digital technology. And I'll say I've only met Ray Kurzweil once, but I liked him. I thought he was a nice guy. So I'm not trying to be mean to Ray Kurzweil, who, as far as I can tell, is a pretty nice person. And in fact, if you had to put someone in charge of the whatever the hell it is we're doing, if you give me like Ray Kurzweil or Sam Altman, I know which one I'm picking every day, right? It's not even subject to question, right? But so moving, the one part of this book that was the weirdest for me was really to think about urban environments, because I started seeing that a lot of the people who were involved in longevity research, involved by paying the money for it, the backers for longevity research were frequently, Silicon Valley AI folk, and they were also contributing to urban design projects. Things like Prospera in Honduras, which is like an attempt at a kind of independent libertarian island nation state thing where they would be interested in regulation-free research into longevity in particular and human augmentation. But so there was a lot of stuff going on in kind of this urban design area. And at the same time, I was thinking about space flight. And of course, if you're going to go to space, you need somewhere to live, right? So this idea of urban design was not just about, oh, does Sam Altman want to like build a libertarian place to live forever? It was also about what kind of place could we live in the future? And there were interesting debates happening between, I mean, we see even today where Jeff Bezos, who's influenced by Gerard O'Neill and talks about space, that we should live in space stations, and Elon Musk talking about, and Robert Zubrin talking about living on Mars, right? So those are different things to talk about living in space stations versus living on the moon or on Mars or whatever else. But this idea of a city in the wilderness is an old idea. It's a religious idea. And there's a long-standing position that if we could just build the right kind of city architecturally, the right city with and I mean social architecture, not just like what the buildings look like. If you could get the social architecture right, you would actually solve some of these problems of humanity. So I've got this guy, on the slide there, Charles Fourier, who believed, and Fourier was a very interesting person. He's the person who actually coined the term feminism because he had a very significant interest in aligning sex equality, like figuring out how to get men and women. That was part of his social architecture, was that people should be equal. And he believed that if you could get the social architecture right, people would all live to be 120 happy years, right? So this idea that getting the city right gets the human biology right is actually kind of an old idea, a couple centuries. And the Fourierists in the U.S., one of the cities they founded is Utopia, Ohio, which, as you might imagine, no longer exists because it's like a big flood came and kind of destroyed the whole town. And now there's just a historical marker, here stood Utopia, Ohio. But what we're seeing though today is lots of efforts at these kind of future cities. NEOM out in Saudi Arabia, Prospera in Honduras, California Forever. I'll tell you, the thing I actually like about California Forever is that the people who are behind California Forever say things like, we're going to make a lot of money. And I like the honesty. I don't like the idea that you're building a city for the purpose of making a lot of money, but I do like it when you're honest about it instead of maybe hiding behind a sense that like, no, what we're doing is just be great for all the human beings or something, when in fact you have a vested financial interest in the outcome. But so these future cities, I think, are all part of this package. And so what it leads up to is this question of spaceflight. All of these are part of the spaceflight question, right? The genetic engineering that might be required if we're biologically going to go to space, right? Or the robots and AI that are definitely required for us to go to space. And I don't mean necessarily uploading our minds into robots, but that's certainly one possible scenario that you see in the literature a lot. But whether it's mind uploading or not, we're going to need robots and AI to make space flight work in a meaningful fashion. And then we're going to need places to live. So what goes on with all these technologies, they come together in spaceflight, and spaceflight is the solution to existential risk, because if we could spread humanity all out everywhere, then we no longer have to worry about, just everyone dying on Earth. So that's a reasonable, I feel that's a reasonable statement for someone to make. We should travel to the stars just so that human civilization, Angela brought up civilization, so that it would persist. right, into the future. And I think that's a worthwhile goal. And so actually in the conclusion of the book, I talk a fair bit about the idea of civilization and why that might matter. And some of the authors in the space even talk about how us going out into space as kind of transcendent AI, whatever, would actually potentially save not just human civilization, earthly, whatever, but the entire universe, right? Ray Kurzweil's like, hey, maybe we'll solve the problem of the universe either collapsing or heat death, whichever one's going to come. Maybe these super, ultra intelligent robots will figure out a solution to that problem. So there's a kind of salvific point of entry here that's very powerful for many of the people who are involved in the conversation. And, most of them are willing to see this much like a sacrificial arrangement where some people are going to die in the process. And, Bill brought up the Challenger disaster. I'm not as old as Bill. Sorry, Bill. So I was a school child when they wheeled in the televisions and we watched the Challenger because it had Kristen McAuliffe, a school teacher, in it. So they'd made a big deal of this in American education. And we all watched when it blew up 90 seconds into flight. And it was traumatic, right? It was deeply problematic. It was traumatic for the nation in a lot of ways that I think actually still linger. That we haven't wrapped our minds around how to handle what that means, that kind of sacrifice. But ultimately, the goal would be then to like send human civilization in different places. And one of the most fun things I read was, I think it was by Christopher Mason, who's a geneticist who works with NASA. I think it was Christopher Mason who talked about basically packing up like little cities, like package a whole city full of the machines that will be necessary to kind of like build things, as well as the machines necessary to take DNA code and create living creatures and to terraform a planet or whatever. You launch this thing and it lands somewhere and it kind of makes an environment and then brings life there, right? It creates a little city for human beings. And then if we, in fact, are information patterns, which is one of those things that Bill was talking about earlier, and I enjoyed the little argument about that when I walked back, when I was able to get back, that was pretty entertaining. If we are information patterns, well, then your consciousness could be like laser ported to this new city somewhere else, right? Because your consciousness could move at light speed, which would still take a little while, but you wouldn't notice, and it would still be an awful lot quicker than flying there in a spaceship, right? So the space package, though, I actually find pretty compelling, but my fear, what gets me involved in a different kind of way than I had been in the past, is that I think people are doing this in ways that are not productive, right? If you argue that something's inevitable, this is evolution, this is the law of accelerating returns, this is just what's going to happen, then all of a sudden we lose the capacity to prioritize human needs, other animal species needs, our planetary needs. Like it disappears under the weight of inevitability. People also tend to defer costs. You can look at like kind of the long-termist movement, which in some sense I sympathize with because I sympathize with the idea of thinking long-term. But if you're going to go, we're going to prioritize people 1,000 years from now and deprioritize people who are alive today, that's like nuts. I mean, that just doesn't make any kind of sense to me. And so we defer the costs always. It was mentioned earlier that not everyone can afford everything, right? So we defer costs quite frequently to the marginalized, whether that's on a national level or an international level. And we don't include everybody, right? And as I mentioned earlier, even the advocates of a lot of this are kind of scared. So I find that all pretty not compelling. But I am a pretty optimistic guy. And I do hope that we can get somewhere good, that we can tell better stories about all this stuff. We have to start by saying it's not inevitable and then start going, how do we build a thing that's worth having? And in the conclusion of the book, I really turned to two key people from kind of my own intellectual history. One was Julian Huxley, who is a problematic figure, right? Like, I mean, Julian Huxley, who was the founder of UNESCO or founding president of UNESCO, and he was a member of the Neo-Darwinian synthesis in biology, but he was also a eugenicist, right? Lifelong, not race-based, but it was more like British class-based. Like some people should have kids and some people shouldn't have kids, right? And eugenics is crap, right? But in other ways, Huxley is very profound, especially when he talks about how humanity has a cosmic office. We're supposed to be doing something to make the world a better place, right? And we're responsible for it, and we have to grow up to that. And in combination with that, one of the most influential books on me personally was Jawaharlal Nehru's book, A Discovery of India. And Nehru was the first prime minister of India and a key figure in the Indian freedom movement. But he also was deeply interested in science and was really interested in how science could and should be responsible for better outcomes. And that should be a part of it. If you as a scientist are not actually trying to do things that alleviate suffering, then you're doing science wrong, right? And I find that a pretty compelling place to be at. So there's my little summary of how we might get somewhere vaguely useful when we start advancing these technologies. Appreciate all your time, and Julio and Martine for setting up this opportunity for us all to be a part of. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so very much, Robert. I'm not going to ask any questions because Robert and I had a conversation about his book, and some parts of the conversation are reflected into the review that I published on the Terasem journal. But however, we do still have a few minutes before I have to switch the recording off for a time limit. And I would like to encourage you to ask questions to Robert.
Julio and I, just so you know, our long-time argument is that Julio thinks that as long as we get to space, it's kind of okay. So if Elon Musk gets us to space, that's good enough because we got to space. And I'm of the opinion that if we go under the wrong kind of approach, we're only going to replicate. I mean, if we go back to this comment, that Angela was trying to make about just sort of exporting our own problematic behaviors. I think if we go to space with a problematic tech environment, a problematic social arrangement, that we won't do anything worth doing there. And so I'd rather my cards on the table. I don't consider Elon Musk particularly trustworthy in this regard either. And I'd rather he weren't in charge of whether we got to space or not. So there's my, feel free to tell me I'm wrong. You could join Julio and tell me I don't know what the hell I'm talking
No,
about.
hold on. I think I want to make a correction to that. As Robert say, I do think that going to space for the wrong reasons is still better than not going to space at all. But having said that, of course, I think that going to space for the right reasons would be even better than that.
Sure, I should have been clear about that.
So that's kind of the burning question that I have to ask you. Well, okay, let's not go to space for the wrong reason, but can you tell me what the fuck the right reasons are? And so we can agree to that.
Well,
Why?
I think the right things to be seeking are shelter for human, animal, plant species. I mean, if we're thinking about space as shelter, that what we're trying, and shelter is, a roof over your head and food to eat, and water to drink, right? And probably meaningful work is part of shelter. But if you have all that stuff, you go to space with that stuff, that seems pretty productive to do that. If you aren't, actively pursuing a sense of shelter for us and other species, feels pretty problematic to me. And so I worry about, this question of the militarization of space, I think is deeply problematic. But also, in some sense, I worry about the way we might think about it in a corporate sense also, right? If profit motives are the only reason we're heading to space, that strikes me as a bad thing that will only replicate bad behaviors. And I'd like us to not replicate bad behaviors. And if we're only going to replicate bad behaviors, I probably think we shouldn't get to space. That we ought to just stay here and like drive ourselves extinct if we're not able to figure out how to build a civilization that really shelters other people.
Instead of saying shelter, how about we just say an expanded environment in the sense that the universe is a big place, much bigger than the Earth, so that space is likely to give us the opportunity to do big things in a big environment. Of course, the opportunity for good things have to come together, parallel opportunity for bad things. But myself, I have enough faith in humanity to believe that we would be able to find the right path.
I don't know that I believe that, but I hope.
I want to believe. I hope, right?
Yeah,
Hope,
like I said, I tend in the optimistic, like I lean optimism. Though that's really hard in the world right now. You just kind of look around the world, and it doesn't really matter where you are on something like a political spectrum, right? I think one of the collective human experiences right now is feeling despair and pessimism. It's just that we have different reasons to feel despair and pessimism, around and about. But I do lean optimistic, and I do hope we can, otherwise I wouldn't have bothered to write the book, right? Like, and I wouldn't bother. It started out of a class. I taught a class on it, and the goal was actually to give my students some tools to think about the technologies of the contemporary moment, and to walk out of it thinking, how can we contribute to a better, technological culture, right? Like, what do we want for the future? So there's optimism baked in there for me. I just don't know if it's merited, and I fear it's not merited.
But let's hope it is. And I think this is the right moment to end the official part of this meeting, so that I'm going to stop the recording. And I want to thank everyone very much. And I look forward to seeing you guys again at one of the next Terasem events.
Thanks for having us.